Welcome to the special episode of the Naan Curry podcast. Today we have Manu Pillai with us. Manu is a writer, a history writer. He's written 3 books, one of which I have next to me, The Courtesan, The Mahatma, and The Italian Brahmin. He's also written The Ivory Throne and Rebel Sultans. He's also a former columnist at The Mint, and I think there's much more to him which he'll talk about today. So I'll leave that up to him. Manu, welcome to the podcast.
I'm happy to be here. I don't know if talking about myself is such a good idea. Back in the day in polite society, it used to be rude to talk about yourself. So I'll try and restrict talking about myself to the minimum.
You're our guest, so I will have to indulge you a bit and let you talk about you, so that our listeners can get context about your life, so that they like you more throughout the podcast, which I'm sure is not an issue, will not be an issue anyway. So Manu, we at the Naan Curry podcast do a lot of history. Like we cover politics, economics, culture, but history is one of our favorite things. And you are a history writer, and a lot of our listeners, in fact, Sadaf and I both, we do a bit of history writing. Sadaf has actually written a book. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it with us today. He is down with potential COVID. Hopefully, he gets well soon. But yeah, my point was that a lot of our listeners and I and Sadaf are interested in history and history writing. So we just wanted to see how you became a history writer, because it's not one of those professions which parents tell you to take up, right? Like nobody says that, oh, आज मेरा बेटा history writer बनेगा, and आपको पता है मेरा बेटा history writer है और ये पढ़ाई करेगा मेरा बेटा, so that he becomes a history writer. So how did you become a history writer? Long drawn way to ask you.
To begin with, becoming any kind of writer in our country is not easy. I don't think it's easy in any country, but
Yeah.
here, there's that social pressure as well. I remember, despite having, as you said, 3 books and all that, I remember going somewhere once, and a cousin of my father, this very old man, in a village in Kerala, he said, "What are you doing these days?" And I said, "I'm writing, etc." And he's like, you're almost 30 years old. You should get a real job and things like that." And I was just like, nodding my head, because what else do you really say? You can't really explain to someone of his generation that you can actually make a living and sort of get by with doing something that you also enjoy doing. But I got into it because I loved reading, and then I cultivated an interest in history. Then the writing of history began quite organically, because I came across a very interesting story at the age of 18. That is what mutated over the next 6 years into The Ivory Throne, which I took up seriously at 19. And then, through my studies and my earlier jobs, etc., I kept writing and finally published it. Once that was done, I did my second book, which was also the time I simultaneously began my PhD, which is ongoing. I've got another year to do. And that allows me space to do both research and writing. That's one of the good things about academics and academia. You can find the time to do something like this without getting bogged down in a job that's in a completely different field. So yeah, it was over many years. It was a slowly constructed idea. It wasn't really, I never really went in thinking that, oh, I want to be a historian, oh, I want to be a writer. Those options, as you said, were not, you never even hear a conversation. You don't have, at least I don't think my parents had any friend who was, a history writer or somebody of any kind of writer. It was, there were professors and teachers and people like that, but they were never described as writers or people who, did something like that for a living. So it was unusual, but to be fair to my parents, they never stood in the way. And, I got lucky with my first book. It did well, which also creates confidence, not just in yourself, but publishers have confidence in you.
Yeah.
And those things help. Luck and timing matter a lot. Otherwise, it can be very precarious. But if you're, a little bit of luck also helps.
Fantastic. So for any budding writer, would you recommend having a career path on the side as well, like you are on the career path of an academician? I sometimes do a bit of writing, definitely not as regular as you, and I do this podcast, but I also have a corporate job which gives me my daily bread, earns me my daily bread, ragi bread, if the regular listeners are aware. So do you recommend that kind of a path for a writer, or do you recommend that a writer should just jump into writing wholesale and not look at an alternative career on the
No,
side?
I don't think it works like that. We also have to live in the world. I mean, unless
Yeah.
you have the privilege to sort of, not have to worry about your income and all that, then you're good. You can do whatever you want. It generally produces very bad writers also, because, it's always good to have a little bit of pressure, because I think it sort of opens your mind in a different way, having to work against the odds in some way or the other. But otherwise, yeah, I think that's why a lot of people are journalists. A lot of people do have day jobs writing columns and newspaper articles and things like that. For me, my Mint column was a fairly remunerative affair for 3 years. It gave me, a regular income, which was really useful. The other thing is also you plan. You don't waste the money that you make. You save like crazy. You invest it in the right places, and those things over a long term sort of period, they come back to help you, as opposed to getting carried away in the moment. Success can be very fleeting. That's the thing with any sort of creative project. Anything that's built on these standalone projects means that you may have a series of successes and then a series of flops, and then if you have a series of flops, the whole thing can be risky. Everything you've built can start shaking, which is why a little bit of planning, a little bit of general sort of sense of what you want, basic lifestyle, which is how much you need to support it. That kind of planning usually helps. So, I've sort of been an acha bacha that way. And the other thing is also, when you're doing a lot of historical research, you really don't have time to go out and spend your money drinking and clubbing and all of that. You really can't. So for me, people, when the pandemic started, people were like, oh, we're stuck at home, can't do this, can't do that. I was like, this is my job anyway. I work from home all the time anyway. So to that extent, the pandemic made no difference in my life. Just that the travel stopped, the literature festival stopped. But sitting at home and working never stops. That was the same. There was no pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. It was just the same routine, whether it was a pandemic or not.
Yeah. So one of my favorite authors, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, actually calls this the barbell career strategy. So he says that you invest 90% of your time in, say, a boring, risk-free venture, and then 10% of your time in a risky, artistic, creative venture. Even if the 10% fails, you still have the 90%, which you can use to feed yourself. But if the 10% takes off massively, then good for you, great for you.
Yeah. But it is a chance. As I said, that's why I said right at the start.
Yeah.
Luck does play a role. We don't give it enough value. We always assume that people's success is just because they're successful or talented. But frankly, luck and timing does make a big difference. There's no dearth of talent, but not all talented people are so-called, successful in quotes. Yeah. That's because there are these other elements. So, if you're lucky, then it works out.
Instagram motivational speakers won't tell you that, though.
Their livelihood depends on it, so I won't hold it against them.
Yeah. Superb. So we do, as I was mentioning, we do history, politics, economics, but now we've entered into career advice and financial advice in the Naan Curry podcast. So we are diversifying. Fantastic. So let's jump into the topic that you want to talk about today, which is kind of broad today. We want to talk about Kerala and the food of Kerala broadly. And before talking about the individual aspects of the food, broadly, I want to talk about the most unique aspects of Kerala food in general. I know there are minute different aspects which are great, but overall, one of the watershed moments of Kerala history was linked to food, which was when Vasco da Gama set foot in Kerala looking for spices as well as Christians. And some of the most common spices that we eat in India, and India is known for its spicy food, so spices are obviously a very important part of our food. And some of the most common spices we eat today were traded through Kerala to India. Now, what would you say is the most unique aspect of food in Kerala, generally speaking?
I think, one thing, I can't think of anything that doesn't have coconut in it. It's just everything is so coconutty. Our chutneys are, the fish curry I grew up eating as a child was coconutty. The avial is coconutty. I think, in these like dal type curries we make, there's a coconut element or a coconut oil element. Even these like, we also have this dish we make where you basically chop, pieces of ripe banana, plantain, into small pieces. And then you do the stir fry, which is sweet. And that's also encrusted with coconut and sugar. Anything I can think about is, coconutty. And there's also the very name of Kerala. There's a coconut element in that also. It's also linked to Kerala's identity in many ways. So I don't think I can think, maybe up the coast there's, similar use of coconut. But one thing that I think is definitely very distinct about Kerala is this constant presence of the coconut everywhere, including in my Instagram handle, which is, what coconut, because it's just always been there. And yeah, I think that for me is one of the big points with Kerala food, because I grew up in Maharashtra. And for us, every year during the summer vacations going back meant a completely different, having to deal with a completely different platter in my grandmother's house. Because here my mother used to make all kinds of food, North Indian, local, Maharashtrian style, all of that, pav bhaji and things like that. And then we go to Kerala and then suddenly everything would be this, drowning in coconut. And I loved it. For me, it was great. I know a lot of people don't, but yeah, for me, that's a very special element in Kerala.
Absolutely. I love it too. I mean, I think I'm a rare North Indian who likes coconut a lot, especially being a Punjabi. Punjabis typically are not fans of coconut. I am very broadly generalizing, but that's what I've seen anecdotally around me. But I absolutely love coconut. And I think the food of Kerala is one of the best in the country. And I'm not saying it just because we're on this podcast discussing Kerala food. Whenever I get a chance to travel again, I will definitely go to Kerala just to eat. I mean, of course, there are tons of other things. The natural beauty is fantastic, but man, the food is gorgeous. It's amazing.
And I forgot to say earlier, coconut milk. It's one of the most divine things in the world. Yeah. Even this whole Thai green curry, one of the reasons it's great is because of that coconut milk. It adds so much richness and flavor. And that's why I'm I think obsessed with the coconut.
There was a Harvard study done, I think, few years back, dismissing or talking about how coconut is unhealthy, or coconut oil is unhealthy. And I loved the response that came out from India that, hey, we've been eating this since thousands of years. We've survived fine. You can't just come up with a study and tell us that what we're eating is crap.
Eating it, putting it on our skin, putting it in our hair.
Exactly.
All over the place. Yeah.
Exactly. You mentioned that the name Kerala has a link with coconut. Tell us something about that.
Yeah, there's this theory that, Keram, Nali Keram is what we call the coconut. We also call it Tenga, but, the proper word is Nali Keram. And that word Keram, or the root apparently, is linked also to the word Kerala.
Yeah.
And, the land of the coconut palm, that kind of a thing. These are, of course, different theories. Now, an etymologist will know better, but this is usually the connection that I've heard people make. Naligerathinte Nadana, Kerala, which is, the land of the coconut palm.
Got it. You are pretty active on social media, and I've been following you on Instagram and Twitter. The first thing that your Twitter bio says that you are a devout vegetarian. Now, I want to know why that's something you want to call out, especially on the first thing on your bio. Is there a strong reason for you to be devout vegetarian?
Not that way, actually. It was just that everybody has these ultra serious sort of bios. Mine has also evolved into a fairly serious one, but I've held on to that slightly comical thing about deviance because, it's just... we sometimes take ourselves too seriously. And the reason I created it was as a child, I was a non-vegetarian in the sense that we ate fish and chicken. But then around 13, I decided to, become a vegetarian, which I sort of held very strongly till I was about 20. But then I moved to London, and as a student there, and this is early phases, I slowly learned to cook. But then you're also dependent on sandwiches, things you eat in your cafes and all that. And then there was at least egg in your nicest, plainest sandwich, and you couldn't get by without a little bit of non-veg. So then I said, okay, fine, I'll give myself some concessions. That later evolved into a stage where I was like, when I travel and go on holidays to interesting places, I shall eat non-veg because, you can't go to a place and not eat local food. So for that reason, I decided, okay, so I'm a vegetarian, but I deviate from it every now and then to taste things that, are not vegetarian purely. This reminds me, my ex-boss, Shashi Sarur, He said, "Oh, you're also vegetarian." I was like, "But here's my qualification." And then he was like, "No, this is not vegetarianism." But I said, why is there only one definition for these things? I'm vegetarian for most part, but when I travel, I'm a non-vegetarian. That's the logic behind my Instagram handle and the description there.
Fantastic. Actually, that makes a lot of sense because you, on an everyday basis, can lead a relatively healthier, ethical life by eating vegetarian food, and then when you're traveling, you're obviously curious, obviously want to try, and you're an intellectual anyway. So you always want to think about food, think about cultural aspects, and food is a huge part of it.
Yeah. I mean, you can't go to say Calicut or Hyderabad. These are places with very sophisticated Muslim culture, and they're both famous for their biryanis. I mean, they compete about which one is the better biryani. Hyderabadis will say theirs is the gold standard, and Calicut will say, look, no, ours is more innovative. But these places are famous for their biryanis and their special meat dishes, and you can't really go to these places and then try and experience the place while missing out on that. At least that's what I think. Not advocating for other vegetarians to also turn into deviant vegetarians, but for me at least, I thought I can give myself that much freedom to occasionally sort of savor what is made in certain places that I don't normally go to.
Yeah. Jumping into one of the very interesting passages from your book, The Ivory Throne, I was reading this story about how Maharani Setu Lakshmi used to eat, and what struck me was that, and this may be more common as well across the country. So I'd like you to tell us about it. What struck me was that in case during a meal somebody from below caste set foot in the room, it would have to be cooked again, and it was sent back, which gets me to a broader question as well about the role of caste in influencing the eating habits of Kerala. How First of all, how important was caste in defining the eating habits, and how much has that evolved in the 21st century?
It's evolved a great deal. I don't think, I mean, all parts of India have a degree of casteism, but in Kerala, it's slightly more subtle in the sense that it's very, very rare to see people who refuse to eat with lower caste people or, higher caste people putting some kind of having this chip on their shoulder. Yeah. You see that perhaps more in the north to this day. For example, Atish Tasir has this book on where he visits a family somewhere in the north on the way to Banaras or on the way back. And he talks about how the driver had to sit separately and all of that. In Kerala, it isn't. I've never seen anything that stark. At a sadhya, at a temple festival, people of all castes sit together. Yeah. There isn't that kind of visual casteism anymore. It exists beneath the surface, but not in such a direct way. But yes, caste was a major part of food habits, and one of the big signifiers of what your status was who you could eat with. So, for example, kings in Kerala, the Zamorin of Calicut had this unique special right where he had what was called Sakshi Bhojanam, which is the right to sit with Brahmins and eat, but not in the same row, in a separate row. So you're a witness to the eating, but you're not eating in the same row. So it's called Sakshi, to witness. The Maharaja of Cochin had a higher status, which was called Panti Bhojanam, which is to be able to sit in the same row with Brahmins and eat with the Brahmins, which suggested his status was higher than the Zamorin status. And, it's so interesting, right? Like who you can sit with and to the extent of whether you can sit in the same row or not can tell you about that person's status. And it's not just royalty. My grandmother had a tutor when she was in her late teens. She was terrible at maths. And there was this gentleman who used to come, and he was from one of these temple-related castes. Yeah. Not a Brahmin, but, sort of in that broad category of temple castes, which meant that he couldn't eat from he had a sacred thread. So you can't eat from the kitchen where, the family doesn't have a sacred thread. So he used to come to teach my grandmother, and her theories, which is perhaps very unkind, but she was terrible at maths, but he used to keep saying Saraswati Bahamirikiya, which is to say, oh, she's such an excellent student, mainly because her mother used to give him good things to eat. But I was like, how is that possible? If he was from a temple caste, how did he come and eat from your house? He's not supposed to eat except from his own kitchen. And she said, no, there's a qualifier. You can't eat cooked food. So you can't eat anything that's been boiled and cooked and steamed in the regular way. So no rice, no curries, no sabzis. But apparently, if you are a higher caste person visiting a non-sacred thread wearing person's house, you can accept food that has been roasted over an open flame. because Agni purifies. So if you roast
Ah,
it, it is not tainted by any kind of casting. It comes out pure. It was immediately roasted and put into a leaf. He would come and pick up the leaf himself. So there was no, let's say, ceremonial defilement or ritual defilement of the food. Food, even, in her own sort of setting, she grew up as the daughter. Her father was a school headmaster, but he was also a big farmer. Like, they had a lot of land and people associated with it. There were Dalits who used to actually do the tilling of the land. There were local Nayars who used to come and help with the other external things. And, the family used to sort of lord over these people. And it was interesting when she told me that even on a festival like Onam, which is like Kerala's national festival, there's a caste system even to the dals that are made. So, the your regular tur
oh,
dal or the yellow
yeah,
dal,
yeah.
that is what the Dalits were allowed to eat. They could not have
Oh,
it in their sadhya or in their feast. They could not have any other kind of dal. A certain other community, which is now in the OBC category, they were allowed what is called horse gram, or we call it mudra. That was the dal, that was the kind of lentil that they were allowed to use. And then there is the green gram, which is
hmm,
what the Nayars and the upper caste used to
yeah.
eat. And I'm sure the Brahmins had something that made them special as well. We're not aware because we're not Brahmins.
Hmm,
But it's interesting that even in one agrarian establishment, the family eats one kind of dal, the subordinate, staff and servants eat another kind, and the agrestic laborers, they are given a third kind of dal, and there can't be any kind of overlap. There's this paisam or a sugary thing that we called the adapradhaman, which
yeah.
again was not permitted to people of certain castes. So what you could eat, how you could eat it, all of these things were linked up very much to caste. And it was linked up often to status. One of the things I mentioned in the Ivory Throne is, and this is, I love mentioning this in several podcasts and talks that I do, is how the Maharani of Travancore, Setu Lakshmi Bai, because she was the Maharani, she was served 4 varieties of paisam in all her feasts. Her husband's status was lower. He was just the consort. He used to get 2 because he was not entitled to all 4 because his status was not high enough as his wife. So food isn't just about the consumption of it. It's not just about eating. It's also a medium through which these social relationships are communicated, sometimes balanced. When a Nair chief like the Kavlapara Nair in Malabar is permitted to start eating with Brahmins in the same room, it basically says, okay, we Brahmins are recognizing you now as higher than the other Nayars. So there's a lot of
Wow.
like intricate
Hmm,
politics and status play that's
yeah.
happening in this business of eating food.
That's fascinating, actually. Digressing a bit from caste, we have an episode on entire episode on dals, where for which I was researching, of course, before the episode, and we found out that a lot of the dals, their names come from what the Britishers saw the animals eating. So if a horse, whatever a horse was eating was named horse
Horse
cram, whatever
cram,
the
yeah,
pigeon was eating was named pigeon pea. And like we as humans have been eating it in India for a long time, but they named it
yeah,
after the animals that
yeah.
that they eat it. I found that hilarious and fascinating.
No, it's not surprising in any way. I hadn't heard of this before like this, but
Yeah,
yeah, I'm not surprised because a lot of these things do come from these very strange, incidents and episodes.
yeah. Moving from caste to religion, I was, as I was mentioning to you, I was in Kerala a couple of years back on a backpacking trip, and I was in Fort Kochi. And what I found fascinating was that in the same sort of 2 kilometer radius, I, attended church, Syrian Christian church, ate at 2 Muslim restaurants, watched a Kathakali dance, which was based on the Ramayana, all like walking distance from each other. And I couldn't figure out if this was a Muslim area, this was a Christian ghetto or a Hindu ghetto, which, unfortunately is not true for other parts of the country. Or you have to go to different parts of a city to eat, say, Muslim food. There's ghettoization, but I couldn't spot that, at least in the Fort Kochi area. So that got me wondering, and I had a hypothesis if maybe you could validate it or completely dismiss it. Is trade and business the reason for peaceful existence of religions in Kerala? Because it's always been a port, and it's gotten trade from all over the world, including Muslim countries, primarily Muslim countries.
Yeah, I mean, traders have always been coming to Kerala.
Hmm.
Even pre-Islam. So a lot of Arabs were coming to Kerala before Islam was even created as a religion. Before the Prophet appeared, before his miracles appeared, there were already Arabs coming to Kerala. So the Arab presence was already there.
Yeah.
What happens is that once they convert to Islam, Islam also comes
Yeah.
to Kerala, before which the Christians came. Now, of course, the Syrian Christians have their legend that Saint Thomas, who was Jesus Christ's disciple in direct sense, he's the one who came and introduced Christianity there. It's again, legends may not reflect accurate fact, but they're also communicating that we are that ancient in this land. We are not newcomers.
Yeah.
So, in fact, there was this ultra right-wing person on Twitter who went to Kerala, and there was this hilarious tweet where they, not hilarious in a serious way, but I found it hilarious because she basically says, "Oh, this place is infested with churches," and I was like, "My God, you have no idea about this place's history."
Yeah.
I think she's from Goa. In Goa, of course, there's a more violent sort of thing with the Portuguese coming in much later period. But you can't really compare what happened in Goa to Kerala, because in Kerala, it's been there for over about 1,500 years. You have Christian presence in Kerala, to the extent that they've essentially become part of several Hindu rituals as well. Again, in my family and a lot of Brahmin families as well, you needed, when the ghee and the oil was brought to the house, it used to be kept outside the kitchen till a Syrian Christian came and touched it and purified it. So unless a Syrian Christian technically brings you the ghee and your oil, you can't make it, you can't use it in your temples, you can't use it in your upper caste Hindu households. You needed a Christian for something like that. So in our family, little Christian boys from a nearby family, they would come and sort of, they'd come and play, and then in the middle of that, they just touch all these things, and that's how it would all be taken into the kitchens. So in Kerala, Christianity has always been a part of the local culture. You even have some instances now. Of course, you don't see it anymore, but there are festivals that were recorded where an image representing Saint Thomas would be carried with, the pictures of various deities, Hindu deities in these temple processions, etc. My cousin is married to a Syrian Christian. A lot of their wedding rituals have very close parallels to what Hindus do in their wedding rituals as well. Because Christianity came here, but it also became part of the local culture. So Onam is celebrated by everybody. There is now a tendency to make it seem like a Hindu festival, but it's not. It was celebrated and is celebrated by everybody because it's Kerala's festival. It doesn't matter what your religious background is. So yeah, there's also been a lot of influence because of Islam as well. You go to the north, the cuisine changes because of the way the Muslims cook their food. I remember even in my childhood, one of our neighbors was a Malayali Christian. And I remember eating at their house once, and I came back and told my mother, "Why is the Christian fish curry so different from our fish curry?" And she was like, "What do you mean Christian fish curry?" I was like, "Their fish curry, there's something different." Turns out they weren't using as much coconut as we were, so the coconut element was removed.
Mm-hmm.
But in their part of Kerala, that's how it was made. You have so many stories of kings inviting Christians and Muslims to come and settle. So the Zamarin was, his kingdom was a big magnet for Muslims because they were given special treatment there. So Arab Muslims would come and settle and help with the trade. You have this now obscure ex-royal family called the Kumkur Rajas in say central or towards South Kerala. So you go to a place called Kottayam, a major Syrian Christian, general Christian hub in terms of population. These Hindu Rajas were great sort of patrons of Christianity. Around Cochin also, it's not just Fort Kochi. If you go to a place nearby called Chendamangalam, which is where the hereditary prime ministers of the Kochi Rajas used to live, there's land that they've given to a Jewish community, and there's an old synagogue there that was constructed for the Jews. So we now think that all these people in the past thought of everything through a prism of religion. Not really. There were so many plural identities around them that one more that came into the land didn't really matter. It was just, one more you add one more to your platter. That was the kind of attitude that a lot of them had. And it's naturally left an impact on several things. So if you look at the oldest mosques, the oldest churches in Kerala, the people who constructed them are the same people who constructed the temples. So they don't have minarets and domes. They have tiled roofs and woodwork and gables and things like that. They resemble palaces and Hindu structures and temples, not what you think is the template for a church or a template for a mosque. The new buildings, of course, are built in the new way with domes and minarets. But the older ones are all constructed in what you would call a Kerala style. And that Kerala style is used for all religious buildings, irrespective of whether they're Christian or Hindu. So yeah, there is a lot of mixing, and you don't see that kind of ghettoization. It is a fairly sort of seamless blending of identities and sites of worship and things like that.
That blending of identities, I want to explore the food aspect of that because it's just fascinating for me, especially right now, considering how we read news, which is polarized. It's often binary. It's either either one religion or the other. We don't acknowledge the common aspects, which are much more than the differences. So the Christian cuisine, Hindu cuisine, and Muslim cuisine. First of all, is there some? Can you bifurcate? Like, can you say Kerala Muslim cuisine, Kerala Christian cuisine, and Kerala Hindu cuisine? And how much have they learned from each other? If you can bifurcate,
they would have learned from each other. I wouldn't bifurcate it in terms of religion. That you can't clearly bifurcate in terms of religion, because what you find is there is a sort of Muslim way, but it's really a region where there is a dominance of, say, a Muslim population and a Muslim elite population. Then that develops certain peculiarities, which frankly comes from the region and that local culture. But we tend to sort of say, okay, that's the Muslim style or the Christian style. But that, as I said, depends a lot on the numbers there and how many people are doing it. So as I said, there are minor differences. For example, I remember, again, my grandmother's childhood, 1930s and 40s. She says that, their sambar and all would not have tomatoes, it wouldn't have onions. And I was like, really? How can you make sambar without potatoes, tomatoes and onions and all that? She said, no, in those days, these upper caste Hindu families did not use several of these vegetables that today we think is, these vegetables are integral to the making of sambar. But apparently that wasn't always the case. But you find that the Christian community, for example, they didn't have so many, let's say, Brahminical hang-ups on, what vegetables were pure and what were not impure, etc. Similarly, you find that, if you go to Malabar, you find sambar which has fish pieces in it, because there it's perfectly normal to do that. And, it's very popular, I hear, with the Muslim community, and with good reason, because it makes sense that they wouldn't have any issues with non-veg in their sambar. So there's those kind of differences do appear, but it also appears along a caste axis. So we now assume that the Onam feast is entirely vegetarian. That's because the Onam feast has been standardized into what the upper castes were eating. That's become the standard Onam feast. Most of these things that we think of as standard or traditional tend to be very upper caste. But if you check even census reports from the 60s and 70s, they talk about how a lot of the castes that are formerly lower castes, they used to eat meat as part of Onam as well. It was not a vegetarian thing for them. From the 19th century onwards, there was this self-conscious purifying of the food by making it more and more vegetarian. But before that, it was normal to have a side of fish or a side of some other meat dish on Onam as well. So a lot of things. I mean, now of course, if you look at it, Brahmins are eating beef in Kerala. There'll be ex-lower caste people who are now pure vegetarians. So a lot of this has changed, and there is a lot of contact, increasingly in that culture of how you eat food and what you eat. But when it begins is really difficult to say, because my grandmother in the late 50s is when she for the first time ate from some other house. Otherwise, it was always her house, her parents' house. For the first time, she was in her late teens, or about 20 maybe, when she ate from a Christian family's house. And she says how she came back and sheepishly told her father, I went to their house and I ate something from there. And she expected some kind of a major blasting, and he was like, no, it's fine. It's not such a big deal. So I think from the 50s onwards, things have changed. The impact of communism also was important, because that helped break down a lot of these old barriers, after which there's been a lot of embracing of each other's food habits and things like that.
I want to talk about the B word that you mentioned, which is something which I personally want to know more about. So a lot of Hindus, even Brahmins, as you mentioned, eat beef in Kerala. Now, one of my hypotheses, and again, I could be wrong here, is that cows in the north were necessary, indispensable, because that was the only source of protein that people consumed. Like dairy was the primary source of protein for people. But because you had in states like Kerala, Goa, you had seafood, and it was acceptable to eat meat. That's why cows could be slaughtered without much of an issue. Is that the reason why people or Hindus accept beef eating in Kerala, or are there other reasons behind this?
Widespread beef eating among what are called Savarnas or upper caste groups is relatively recent, because earlier they did not. Beef eating was associated with certain lower castes, and that there wasn't taboo. That was, part of their norm. There was no judgment of that. Eating beef was not such a big deal. It's just that they did it, we do not do it. The cow was sacred for upper caste groups. But in recent years, in perhaps the last 3 or 4 decades, that has gone away. There isn't that kind of sanctity attached to the cow. So when you
Got
come
it.
to Kerala and say you want a beef fry, which is sold quite literally on the roadside, there are
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
tattagadas, as we call them,
Yeah.
on the streets of Trivandrum and Kochi,
Yeah.
where you get your dosa and appam and your beef curry, and that's actually cow meat. It's not buffalo or any other
Yeah.
pseudo beef. It's the
Yeah.
it's the actual thing,
Yeah.
and people have no issues with it because
Yeah.
and this is the thing, cultures evolve, people's mindsets change, and in Kerala it's changed pretty rapidly. Even though Kerala was one of the most orthodox sort of places in the entire country in terms of caste taboos and ritual purity and all that, it also surprisingly became one of the fastest to change. And again, I would say that the impact of communism made a difference. Otherwise, traditionally, it was, as I said, certain lower caste groups that used to
Sure.
eat beef. From everything I've heard, which is anecdotally in the family, etc., it wasn't considered taboo. It was their thing. It was perfectly within their system, and nobody else went and dictated that you're not supposed to do it. So the cow is sacred did not mean that everybody went about lecturing others saying, how can you eat this because this is our sacred animal. No, we will not eat it, but you are free to consume beef. So it's a bit mixed up in that sense.
So I love that, that you could live with that tension that we will not eat it, but we're okay with you eating it.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I see that at my house a lot personally. We all of us have, like, there's 6 of us in the house, and we all of us have different choices. And thankfully, we don't intervene. And most of us say that I will not eat it, but you can eat
Yeah, I
a
mean,
specific
much
thing.
of this is a personal choice now.
Yeah.
Earlier, eating was often, as we discussed in the earlier part of this podcast, what you ate and how you ate was often about identity, keeping that identity together, your caste position, all of that. Many of these barriers have no longer exist. People are much more individualistic in how they define their tastes and how they define their choices. Whereas earlier, that individual option was perhaps not so strong. Not that it prevented people. This is another thing. We always assume our ancestors followed all the rules, but they did not. I'm perfect. My grandmother, again, wonderful, stories and anecdotes. As I said, I haven't seen this casteist era, right? So my source of information for it comes from her. And she talks about how they had these maids again from from these temple castes who are again not supposed to come and eat from our kitchens, but they all did. It's just that they didn't eat in the house. They used to pack it up and take it home and eat it at home. So they were flouting caste rules by eating food cooked in a non-Brahmin's house. But how did they sort of cover it up and paper it over? They wouldn't eat it in the house. They would take it to their house and eat it there.
Yeah.
So it's cooked in a lower caste, for them, a lower caste person's house. But because they're not eating it in the lower caste house, they claim that it doesn't affect them. Similarly, her uncles and all of them, they're not supposed to eat meat. But, secretly, everything was possible. I think my great-great-grandfather was the one who introduced meat into the family. So earlier, the meat used to be cooked outside the kitchen. Slowly, one generation passed, it came closer to the kitchen, and finally, it entered the kitchen. It was, normal. But then small details. For example, even now, she can't eat what she calls big fish. There's recently we ate something, and she said, "Oh, this is not even a fish. This is just some creature of the ocean that's got eyes, and it's not really a fish." Your theories are really bizarre. But they used to eat these what are called small fish, which had to be sea fish, seafood. It couldn't be river. It couldn't be from the river. It couldn't be from a pond. So there were some small, details in what kind of fish was consumed. But it's interesting that even in that era, people were able to break these norms. They were not supposed to consume alcohol, but they always found ways to do it. It's not like these things didn't happen. You have 19th century evidence of even women from royal backgrounds secretly drinking alcohol, and how one of the options was when women had their periods, they used to go and segregate themselves, and it was also the room to which they retired when they were generally ill. So if there was any kind of illness, you wouldn't stir from that particular room. It was the resting place, as it were. So this was the place where a lot of these things were done. A lot of contraband was consumed in these places. And your elders in the family who may or may not be orthodox, they're none the wiser because they don't know it's happening. And these things happen left, right, and center. So we shouldn't assume that these rules existing in the past meant that everybody followed them. Do we follow all the rules? We don't.
True.
So we should extend that very human courtesy to our ancestors also, in that they also were perfectly capable of flouting whatever they were told were the rules. They were also capable of having a little bit of curiosity in terms of what they ate and drank and all of that.
Yeah. I love that. And I also love what you said about identities. Earlier you had to follow certain rules, or at least pretend to follow certain rules to be part of a certain social group. But now because of the internet, you're part of a million identities. I am an iPhone user, for example, a MacBook user. I am left liberal. I am economics writer. So you can become you can find other people of your kind all over the world, and that you attach your identity to that as well, which did not exist earlier. So you had to attach your identity to more local ideas. So yeah, that's changed a lot.
Yeah, because I think the idea of community was much stronger than the idea of the individual. So your networks of identity were my family, my caste, the broader community. That's how it was. Those inner pyramids were sort of built that way. Now it's much more my individual rights, my individual tastes, and what I want to do as an individual. And this is also why a lot of Orthodox people find this time very disturbing, because they say, "Oh, our roots are sort of being uprooted. Everything is breaking down," because it's basically a clash between those two ways of defining identity. Do you define it as an individual who gets to do what he wants to, or what she wants to do? Or do you define yourself as part of a larger community and what that identity means?
Yeah. I want to jump into something you have written extensively about, which is the Travancore royal family. You've literally written the book on it. So tell us something about the royal food of the Travancore royal family in its heyday. And was it different from what the common people ate and eat now in Trivandrum?
Some of these things, any kind of elites, some of their habits now are very disturbing to me. For example, one of my great-great-grandfathers, I can't believe it, he used to have something called, he used to basically pour milk into his rice. Firstly, there's a kind of rice gruel, which we usually make with water, and then, it's called kanji. But there's also something called pal kanji, which is made separately, where the rice is boiled in the milk. That's another thing. This is actually pouring milk into your rice, which has been pre-cooked and kept. And there are these things called merkortis, which is stir-fried, nice, almost like dry, veggies and things that you can make.
Yeah.
And he would mix that savory item with the milk and the rice, and then maybe add some sugar on it. And that's how he ate. And I find that really disturbing and disgusting. But apparently, that was, a cool thing to do in the 1920s, which is when he existed.
Yeah.
So I mean, that local sort of elite person, his habits were almost like from a different planet. I can't imagine mixing milk and rice and a sabji or whatever with that strange combination. The royal family, they had, of course, they were vegetarians because they were highly Brahminized in their habits.
Yeah.
It meant that they had to have multiple options. So what I was told, for example, about the Maharani was that it was not as though she would eat all of these things, but all of these things had to be presented on her leaf. So the idea was usually at a Malayali sadhya or a feast, you have one plantain leaf of which you eat. In the case of the royal family, it could be 2-3 that are sort of spread out in a line, and one person comes and sits in front of it. And then these multiple items are kept in silver bowls, on the leaf. And it could be small quantities of all kinds of things. So as I said, 4 varieties of payasam alone, different kinds of chutneys, different kinds of cooked vegetables, so some kind of, multiple set of dry, veggies and things like that. And even the rice could be of multiple types. There'd be different curries. So there'd be a certain bit of rice that you eat with your sambar dal type of thing. There'd be another that you have with what is called more, which is your, this thing, which made with dahi and all that. So you have some with that. So there's different kinds of curries, which means there are different combinations, and old people even know how to eat that in the systematic sort of way. So if somebody sees me eating a sadhya, they may actually think that I'm not doing it properly because I'm trying to sort of, eating at will, whatever I want with each sort of morsel of rice. But older people have a protocol as to what goes where and how you're supposed to eat each item with, which element of the rice and which curry and things like that. So there's some of that. Of course, there are all these caste rules, but again, they were also not completely immune from change. So, the senior Maharani Setulakshmi Bai's husband was a big, he used to go and shoot in the forests. Every time he heard there was a tiger on the loose or a wild elephant somewhere, he'd go and shoot it. And in these long sort of stints that he would spend in the forests, he would interact with the local tribes. And in the Maharani's kitchen, there was this one particular tiel, which is this one dish, which was called katle tel, which was brought from the forest. It was a recipe he picked up from the tribes in the forest, very dark tel, and they used to make that. Similarly, another thing is the junior Maharani. She used to entertain a lot of people, a lot of Europeans, etc. So she had what was called the Indian kitchen and the English kitchen. So there was no overlap. So your vegetarian food cooked here, your non-veg cooked in a different section. Then, of course, if you're hosting a lot of English people and all that, they would, require alcohol and things like that. So there was that stocked and kept. You couldn't, of course, deprive them of meat. So she was a vegetarian, but her kitchens made non-veg food. And her great-grandson's written how, while her guests were served fried fish, she was also served something that looked exactly like fish, but it wasn't. It was tapioca, shaped and fried in the same way to appear like a fish. So it would look like everybody was eating the same thing, but was not actually fish. It was tapioca, or what we call kappa. So there are these like strange adaptations. That is natural. The more you're exposed to the world, the more your tastes also slowly change, and you can see some of that in these royal kitchens. You have the orthodox element, where the vegetables are chopped by Naya women, but the food has to be cooked by Brahmin women. The food has to be served by Brahmins, but the leaf is removed by Nayas, because a Brahmin will not touch a used plate or a used leaf. So firstly, there's that whole elaborate protocol around the food. Then, of course, there's what is being cooked. So it'll have to be the best rice. It'll have to be the best kind of veggies and things like that. There'll be home farms that are specially catering to the royal family. That'll be another element. And then there is innovation that comes in, from these foreign elements, which could range from tribal elements to British-inspired desserts and things like that. So yeah, they were also places of experimentation and innovation.
So the United States is a lot of scientific labs in the United States are spending a lot of time making vegetarian equivalents of meat dishes.
Yeah,
and I've been thinking that those kind of dishes have been existing in India for a long time. Kathal or jackfruit is commonly used as a meat substitute in meat gravies all over the country, not just in North India, everywhere. You mentioned tapioca-shaped fish, or you have tapioca like dish which looks like fish. That's again something which comes to mind when you think about meat substitutes which are vegetarian. So always been existing in our country.
Frankly, you mentioned jackfruit reminds me of my own childhood. The amount of fruit we had around my grandmother's house. It wasn't just one kind. Jackfruit alone, there are multiple kinds. So there's one called, in Malayalam, we call it tenvarika, which is basically so full of like nectar inside. So you can't eat it without making a mess because it's overflowing with juice. Then there's the other, which is drier, which is just you eat the jackfruit piece, and it's got the juice inside, but nothing that's overflowing. Then there's another one which I forget the Malayalam name for, which is extremely fibrous. Like it's almost like someone's like wet cotton, and then sort of much more tasty. It's not like eating wet cotton, but that kind of texture. So there's that just in jackfruit. In terms of mangoes also, there were so many trees that we had there. We still have some of them. So small Kerala mangoes, which you don't really cut up. You really suck it out. You just chop off the top, and then you suck out the rest from under the skin. And it's the most violently, visually disgusting way of eating, but it's extremely delicious. Then there are these other ones which, are sort of totapuri, I think, but a Kerala version of the totapuri, which is best eaten when it's raw or sort of semi-ripe. And then you eat it with salt, and that was our afternoon pastime. We used to cut it, my sister specifically, she used to cut it and then mix it with a little bit of salt and chili powder, and it was like this amazing thing to eat. Even the varieties of fruit, there's banana, that's your usual yellow banana, then you have what is called etapazham or the plantain, but you also have this banana which has a red outer skin, so the peel is red or maroon or whatever, rather than yellow or green. So there's so many varieties of even fruits around us. Now that I think back, living in a city, really sometimes you miss out on a lot of these things that you get in the countryside.
Where was this, if I may ask?
In Kerala, Alleppey district.
Alleppey district, correct.
Yeah. So it was, and we had several acres. We still have it, but nobody lives there. It's just full of trees and all of that. And these trees have their own histories, right? So many of these trees were planted by one of my great-great-grandfathers. And there was one tree, and my grandmother says that in the summers, she and her brother were the lords of that place because their father was this big landlord. All the kids in that area, they would all come there. And this plucking of the mangoes by the kids was this huge like festival for all these kids. But then because they were the owners, she and her brother would sit and sort of distribute it. So they would take the best mangoes for themselves, and then because there was a lot, and then the rest would be distributed to their various subordinate friends, and they would all take it home. And I find that, and to think that that same tree is still there when we were kids, and we would enjoy it. Of course, there weren't 50 other kids coming from the village to collect mangoes from us by the time we were born. But it tells you about culture also. It's telling you something about memories that are built around that single tree that was planted by some gentleman in the 19th century. And it created memories for multiple generations since.
Lovely. One of my favorite vegetarian meals ever has been at this tiny home in Alleppey. So I went to Alleppey and I took one of those boat tours. Not the large boat but a smaller one, because I wanted to go into the narrower streams. And part of that tour was a vegetarian meal, and I assumed that typically these tours they feed you junk in the middle because they want to just save costs and whatnot. That's what I've experienced with such small tours while traveling everywhere in the world. But this tour guide took us to a tiny home in Alleppey, in the middle of our boat ride. And there were a couple of ladies feeding us, and they fed us some of the most fantastic. They fed us, of course, on a banana, on a plantain leaf, and they fed us red rice, kadala curry, and bunch of dals, and some vegetable with of course coconut. And it was just lovely. And they were feeding us like we were just guests at their place rather than their customers, which was just, I think, that made it more memorable than anything else.
No, even the process of cooking this, especially when, not anymore, I suppose, but when it used to be an agrarian economy, a predominantly agrarian economy, you weren't just cooking for a family. So when my grandmother talks about her mother, she was in charge of an establishment where it was her kids, her husband, of course, her brothers or whatever. But then there was the staff that worked inside the house, then the people outside the house, then your laborers who were working in the fields, the people who were taking care of the cattle. And visitors, people passing on the road sometimes. In those days, there are no restaurants and motels and things like that. So when they see a house that looks like it's a major house, they would come and generally be given something there. So usually, for instance, water would not be served. Nobody. When you give them something, it's that leftover water from making your rice. You sort of save that water and give that. And if it goes cold, then you mix a little buttermilk in it. And you give that to visitors and to anybody who comes into the house. If somebody comes to your house and says, "Can you give me some water?" and you give them plain water, they'll throw it in your face because it's rude to give them plain water.
Wow,
but then there's the one specific thing I remember is there were these huge clay urn type things, which they would start cooking things in early in the morning. So at the lowest level would be the tapioca, because that takes a long time to sort of cook. Then you create a sort of layer with banana leaves, and you put the next item. And at the top, I think, would be sweet potatoes, raw plantains, things like that, which don't take that long to cook. So the steam, by the time it comes to the top, it takes some time. So the process, it takes longer for the stuff at the bottom to cook than the stuff at the top. And then it's very visual. So they remove all this, sort of distribute it. So the bananas are taken out and given first. Then they wait for the tapioca to cook. So that's eventually removed last. Lovely. And it's taken like that and then hit onto a person's leaf with a little bit of force. So the thing splits. And so the harder outside and the softer inside sort of, are both visible. And it used to be eaten with, and they just pluck these chilies that were growing wild all over the place. Quickly sort of crush it with this. And there'd be buffalo milk yogurt that would be given with this. And the way it's described, you can almost, get you have your mouth starts watering because of the way it's described about all these people sitting down and eating it. And people would come from places to collect that morning's thing. This is what was given in the morning before the laborers went to the field. Then, of course, in the afternoon, they'd be served their rice and their sort of very strong carbs for the rest of the day, because they need that kind of energy to burn. And then, of course, the evening fare would be completely different. So even that process of running an agrarian establishment involved not cooking just for a family of 5 or a family of 6. You're really talking about dozens of people that you're cooking for across caste backgrounds. And and it includes giving them fruit in the middle. It includes giving them this rice gruel water in the middle. It includes giving them this strange thing that's been cooked with the curds and all of that. So it's just fascinating to even think of that world. So the food isn't really just about eating. It also, in a way, represents that entire agrarian ecosystem as it existed in that
Yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah. So, Manu, what we were talking about all kinds of aspects of food in Kerala. One thing I want to know more about is the toddy shop drinking culture. Sadly, when I visited, I wasn't able to personally go to one, but I heard the food there is fantastic. And my second part of the question is that is drinking or drinking alcohol a serious problem in Kerala? There were some regulatory curbs a couple of years back, which aimed to reduce drinking in Kerala. Is first of all toddy shops, and then is it a problem? Is alcohol a problem?
I mean, it must be because I hear that a lot of women do have husbands who are drunks, and it often creates problems at home.
Yeah.
Even if they don't create trouble outside, it's often the women at home who suffer. And you have cases. I know a family, somebody connected to us, where this lady would go out and sort of work and slog and make the money for the household. And the husband was basically spending all his money on drinking. So she was
Yeah.
essentially taking care of the entire family while the husband was, whiling away not whiling away his time. He was working and drinking. He was sort of spending all his money on drink at the end of the day. And that sort of thing, I assume, is common. I don't know to what extent it is extraordinarily or egregious in Kerala. It could be that other places also have the same problem.
Yeah.
Kerala does have a strong drinking culture because in
Yeah.
the Ivory Throne, for example, I write how even in the 1920s, one of the big import items in Kerala was liquor because people already were starting to have disposable income of a kind that allowed them to be consumers of these luxury products, which may at that time in the rest of India not have been that easy, or at least in many parts of India not have been that easy. Toddy itself, of course, again is a cultural phenomenon. It's not really about alcoholism or drinking. These are again places where people, let's say, in many ways twist the rules, even if they don't break the rules. I'll again give you an example. One of my great uncles, I won't go into the exact relationship because what will happen is his descendants will be upset. But one of these great uncles, officially on the face of it, was great Bhagavatar, which is he was he knew his classical music and he was a great expert at it. Seemingly a very pious man who would walk around with those religious marks and all of that. But he had an appetite for toddy, and the supplier was this lady who comes from a lower caste. She was a local supplier. Obviously, this so-called man with all his marks and his ashes on his body and all his like religious thing and the bhakti ganams that he's doing on the side.
Yeah.
Every now and then he would go to this lady's little hut.
Yeah.
And she knew. That's the thing. This woman had clients from various castes. So she obviously knew each one's tastes and what they preferred and all of that. So when he went there, she knew exactly what to give, how to serve, etc. And there was a sort of unspoken understanding, which is that, there were certain ways of indicating that, look, there's an important person here who's not supposed to be seen here. So no other person enter my hut at this time. Because, if you enter and catch him here, then it's embarrassing. A person of his position is not supposed to be here. So what it basically indicates is that even back in the day, these were places of some kind of experimentation, some kind of relief from all these rules that you're living with, etc., and bending the rules. And again, then as today, people have a taste for alcohol, whether society approves of it or not. It's always been around. And the funniest story is, of course, she was once raided for some reason by excise people, and this poor uncle of ours had to be wrapped up in a mat and kept in a corner. They had these huge mats, in those days. So he was wrapped up and he had to hide in a corner because he couldn't be found by the police sitting inside her hut, given his social position. So yeah, that's the story it reminds me of. But I haven't personally had toddy to this day because my father and all in their generation, it was still made, and you could like see these coconut trees on which you would have those pots there and it will ferment and all of that. But I haven't seen it. I've only had this fake overpriced toddy that you get in these hotels in Kerala today, which are really only for tourists, and they're not I don't think they're the legitimate item. But again, I find it a bit awkward to go looking for a toddy place in my ancestral village for the same reason as my great uncle, which is that how do I even go looking for this? Who do I ask? It's not a question you can openly ask to your elders, saying, "Hey, where is the nearest toddy shop where I can go and experiment and see if I can get some toddy?" But yeah, that's it's again one of those places where norms of caste could be broken. So if that toddy making lady from this lower caste came to your house, she would not be allowed to enter the house. But
Correct.
you can go to her place and drink what she serves you in her glass, because a different context, different set of rules apply. And so long as nobody openly challenges it, it's a tacit understanding in society. Look, these things happen. We're just going to look the other way and let it happen.
Yeah. Got it. From alcohol to a different extreme. So I want to talk to you about Ayurveda. Now, Nambutri Nair cuisine has evolved with a particular concern for health based on Ayurvedic principles. For example, the community sticks to Ayurvedic local spices rather than eating chili, which is considered foreign according to Ayurveda. Do you see Ayurveda thriving in Kerala right now, or has the local generation forgotten about it, or is oblivious to it?
No, it definitely is thriving. It's because it is one of Kerala's soft power elements to this day.
Yeah.
You have these places. Not all are equally good. There are some that are just people have no idea what they're doing. And my grandmother went once to one, and there's this thing called Shira Bala. Now the thing is, Shira also sounds, it's a process. It's a very elaborate process. But Shira also sounds very similar to Chira, which is, I think, Gajar. Not Gajar. It's I think palak. What in Hindi you call palak is what we call Chira. And my grandmother asked the lady who was sort of doing her thing, do you know what the Shira Bala is? And she said, I think it has something to do with Chira, and you take the juice of the Chira and do this. My grandmother was like, no, that is not what it is. So there are people who do it, but then there are people who know what they're doing. There is that difference. To the extent of food, of course, there are, again, my grandmother's father, who was landlord come high school master, plus, he was also an Ayurvedic physician. I think in a lot of families, people learned these things often. It was just a part of everyday existence. So I do know that certain treatments, etc., you're not supposed to eat certain kinds of food. You have to be on an extremely strict diet. And frankly, if you go and meddle with it, it really upsets your body.
Absolutely.
And you end up like throwing up everything you eat. Your body simply can't take it, because you're being given something that's meant to be balanced by something else. You can't go searching for taste in the middle of it. There are certain treatments in Ayurveda where you're not supposed to drink water. Except a certain quantity at certain fixed times, and you simply can't. No liquid is allowed to enter your body during those hours that are mandated. In terms of how it affects general food, that is debatable, because again, I think a lot of it depends on, as you said, Nambudri Nair, it depends a lot on the caste position. It depends on how much exposure there is. Technically, you should only be eating rice and these typical curries. But the thing is, a lot of Nairs also couldn't afford it. A lot of Nairs had also fallen by the 19th century, for example, on hard times, which meant your capacity to keep up some of these rules and what is ideal, etc., depends also on your economic situation. If you're not well off, you really can't be choosy about what you're going to eat. That's how tapioca comes in and becomes a staple in Kerala.
Makes sense.
It's actually imported from South America and grown in Kerala from the 1870s and 80s. And it's then that today you go to Kerala, everybody assumes kappa has always been a staple in Kerala, but it's not. It became popular only from the late 19th century as an alternative to eating grain and rice, because not everybody could afford grain and rice. Tapioca became a sort of same kind of carbs and nutrition that you were getting from grain, but at a much cheaper option that anybody could grow if they had a little piece of land. So, I would hesitate to say that these pristine principles as enshrined in Ayurveda were followed by everybody. I think they were perhaps followed in degrees, but not in any uniform way. They were not followed, even among the Brahmins. I doubt very much that all of it was followed in the same way. Again, economic factors would matter, regional factors would make a difference. So, a Brahmin in Malabar would eat very different, or have a very different style of choosing what to eat and how to make it than a Brahmin in South Kerala, because again, there are variations between sub-regions within the state.
Definitely. We're personally really big on Ayurveda and the Naan Curry podcast. So typically we do episodes related to one dish, and then we talk about the Ayurvedic, what Ayurveda says about that dish and the Ayurvedic benefits of that dish. Love that. Before we wrap, Manu, we have to come back to you. We have to talk about what your underrated, overrated, and favorite foods are. So tell us.
Favorite is relatively easy because there's these payasams that are made in temples. You try and make it at home, and somehow something is missing. For example, there's the Ambalapura temple, which is famous for this pal payasam, this milky
Yeah.
payasam,
Yeah.
and it's absolutely delicious. Now, it's
Yeah.
just the right dose of sugar. So it's not over sugary, but it's also not under sugared. It's sort of just the right kind of aftertaste of sugar that you get. Just the right mix of milkiness and water in it. That I think is one of my favorites. And again, it depends a lot on who's making it as well. Different communities make it in different ways. It's possible the temple priests come from a community, and their kitchens are run by people of a certain community. Therefore, that has a taste that we don't get when we make the same thing at home. So that's definitely a favorite.
We've done a short segment on the Ambalapura payasam in our Kheer episode. Yeah.
It's quite famous. Different temples have different things. There's one god who's very fond of chocolate, and
wow,
he's called, I think, Munch Murugan. So you have to give specifically Munch at that temple because the deity has formed an appetite for Munch. What were the other questions?
So that was your favorite.
Payasam.
Yeah. What about your underrated and overrated? And feel free to be as controversial as you want. We love that.
I think overrated is avial. I've never really understood what this obsession with avial is. For me, it's one of the... I mean, it's eatable. I mean, it's got plenty of veggies, so I know it's nutritious. But, I've never really got what is tasty in avial. It simply makes no sense to me. What is underrated is we have this, what we call pyramidcorti, which is, one. I think it's green gram, which is, I don't know how to describe it. I'm not a cook, so I'm really not sure how to describe it. But it's made in this wok-like thing, which we call the China chutney. It's a dry thing. It's not. It's a dry dish. And eating that with rice, and a lot of people mix curds with it, but I like a much simpler formula, which is to have it with nice chutney. You mix it with a nice coconut chutney and just have that pyramidcorti. And it's
what is it made of?
What? Sorry.
What is it made of?
It's made of green grams, I think.
Green grams, okay.
Yeah. By the end, it becomes, of course, very brown and with a little bit of oil, and it's very simple to make. I made it recently. You basically put it into that. You put a little bit of oil, etc., into the wok. Your salt, your molagu podi or the chili powder, and then you add. This is already steamed, so you add it. Sort of stir it till it's almost sort of crisp around the edges of each element in it. And and then you mix it with your ordinary rice and chutney, and it is divine. It's absolutely great.
Fantastic. That sounds like something I can try at home, and I don't have to go to Kerala to do that. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Manu. It's been an absolute pleasure, and you've been very generous with your time.
Thank you for having me. I'm not sure if I had anything useful to say for your listeners. They may have expected more food and less digressions of the kind that I came up with, but hopefully you enjoyed it.
Absolutely, and we love digression, so I'm sure our listeners will enjoy it. And that's a wrap on the show.